This is part 2 of I Just Wanted to Breathe. In part 1, I finished up where I was crossing the street, or at least getting ready to, and I saw an older woman, and I saw her as her child self. And I had feelings of emotion, of love that welled up within me, and I lingered there for a moment. And yet, when I crossed the street, it was as if I crossed through a veil, because I came into very familiar surroundings, my everyday surroundings within my home. I walked in, it looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. I didn't feel the same. It didn't change. I changed. Something within me changed. The experience I had was still lingering. It lingered for weeks. So in that time, during those weeks, I became acclimated to experiencing this world that I existed in differently. It was all the same. My feelings of how I felt within it were completely different. I could say that I felt more isolated, but I had already isolated myself enough by this time, prior to having this experience. So it wasn't like too much of my life had changed necessarily. Most of the relationships I had were with people who I would have phone conversations with on a day-to-day basis for any number of reasons pertaining to media or friendships that were cross-country like that. In fact, one friend, her name is Nashi. We've lost touch over the years, but back then we were speaking regularly, every day, practically. And I told her about the experience. And she was very connected, very intuitive, and really someone I felt safe telling it to. And helped me to process this in a way that was, in a way that felt understood, even though I didn't understand why it happened, only that it was something significant and it was a gift. So, I mention her because one day in the ensuing weeks, and by the way, every time I went out for a walk after that, every time, I was looking for that profound experience to happen all over again. And the funny thing was that it didn't. Now, I was already still holding so much of that energy in my body, in my feelings, in my heart. I was already still holding that really, when you think about it, it didn't have to happen. In some respects, you could say it was like a high, where I wanted that feeling again and again. But it wouldn't come, not that extreme, no. And maybe that was just a way of giving me time to process everything, integrate everything that I had been through that day energetically. But one day, I went for a walk, and as usual, I started breathing deeply. And it got to a point where the moment I stepped out the door, a deep breath in, and a deep breath out. And I would keep it up, inhaling and holding and exhaling, time after time after time. I crossed the street. I walked 2 just over 2 blocks. And suddenly that feeling came over me, totally unexpected. But this time there wasn't light that I looked up at. There weren't any clouds that I was looking at. I was basically just looking straight ahead, feeling myself within while I was taking these deep breaths. And the next thing I knew, I was hyperventilating, and tears started streaming out of my eyes, and I was in that experience in an instant. So there I am, hyperventilating, and these tears streaming down, and suddenly the phone in my pocket started vibrating, and it shook me out of that experience. But not entirely completely, but it just redirected my attention. And for whatever reason, because of that interruption, I pulled the phone out of my pocket. I looked, and I saw it was Nashi. And I thought for a moment whether or not I should answer because I was still hyperventilating. And I decided for whatever reason to answer. And I said, hello. And it was Nashi. Joe, how are you doing? I'm fine. She said, Joe, what's the matter? There I was hyperventilating, and it was obvious I wasn't fine, at least from her perspective. She thought something was seriously wrong. But it was just the opposite. And I told her that it happened again, that it was happening when she called. And I questioned whether or not I should answer the phone, but I decided to answer it anyway. I don't remember what she said, other than we had a brief conversation. She had already understood that I had this experience, the big one, that we spoke about. So, by way of honoring that gift that I was being given again, she made the conversation very short. I said goodbye, we hung up, and I continued my walk. It took a bit of time before the tears stopped completely. The hyperventilation had already stopped. And I was just breathing deeply and collecting myself. And in one respect, I was very, very happy that the experience happened. In another, I felt this pang of regret that I interrupted the experience with the phone call. And then in the next moment, I just let it all be okay. What I didn't mention was, in those weeks that passed after the first experience, I found that my responses to things in daily life seemed to be a little more forgiving, understanding, accepting, allowing. I just felt like I wanted everything to just be okay. I didn't feel a drama in anything. I didn't want to feel drama in anything. I continued my walk, hoping for that feeling to come back again. And it didn't. And then becoming accustomed to just letting it be okay. But one thing that continued was the deep breathing that I would take. day after day after day. Each day, at some point or another, looking for, hoping for that feeling to return. Each day, reminding myself that it's perfectly okay. Besides, there was so much beauty to see and hear and even feel. If the blowing wind, for example, is something that you can feel as a thing of beauty. Birds singing, trees swaying, leaves rustling on their branches. At one point, weeks later, and by this time, there was a big difference in my demeanor. My children even noticed, and they weren't taking notice of much at this time, because they were mainly concerned and interested in their lives, the lives that they were having outside the home, the exciting lives they were living, growing up and having experiences out in the world. But at the time, there was a family gathering, and everyone was out on the deck. It was summertime, warm, the umbrella up, conversation, music. And I was in the den with my son for a moment, and he had separated himself for a bit because, well, maybe it wasn't teenager enough activity for him. Nevertheless, he and I would have conversations about things that were meaningful, and he grew accustomed to this over the years. He knew that when I spoke to him, there was meaning behind it. And one day I felt like I needed to confide in him, to tell him about my experience. And that was the day. So there was all this activity out on the deck, sliding doors closed, he and I in the den. And even though several weeks had passed, even though I'd had this experience in a huge and profound way the first time, and again when I had that call, it was so present and so part of who and how I was experiencing this world anymore, that when I started telling him about it, I started having tears streaming down my face. And you could say, in a sense, that at one point, when I tried to tell him, when it reached its peak, I felt like I was blubbering. Oh. He looked at me, seriously, he looked at me. And he said, "Man, there's something wrong with you." Yeah, he was definitely a teenager. Well, that didn't go very well. At least not from the standpoint of having somebody understand. And all that really did for me at the time was underscore this discernment that I had related to who I shared personal things with, really. How many people can we look to and know that we can tell them something truly, truly personal and feel understood? I was processing lots of emotion at that time, much of it in the realm of wonder. So many people shed tears from sadness and grief and fear and worry. And yet here I was having this prolonged experience of shedding tears over and over and over again because of wonder. There would be occasions then afterwards where I would be sitting at my desk, and I was meditating still at home at my desk, for example. I would sit back, take a few deep breaths, and quiet for a few minutes at a time. And I would drop into a meditation. And oftentimes, because of the breath, I triggered that welling up of emotion all over again, and the waterworks started. And this went on and on and on. Ultimately, it got to a point where I didn't feel like even speaking about anything if it wasn't truly from the heart. There was no television. There wasn't even listening to radio shows. For the most part, I lived very much in silence or listening to music that was instrumentals and would take me into experiences of calm and peacefulness. And it didn't get old. And then, on subsequent walks, a few months later, I found that I had the experience again, almost like it was a change of season experience. And I was happy and relieved and still didn't really know what to do with this other than want the experience and welcome it. And then I wondered whether or not it would happen again after that. And that's when it would become part of my life, having these experiences triggered by breath when I would sit back. There would be occasions where I would be talking to someone, having a conversation, and something that was said, maybe some image that was brought up, it would trigger that experience, and sometimes I'd have to excuse myself. Just enough to be able to compose myself. Not that I would go into a full-blown experience. But then fast forward to about 18 months later, I was contacted to see about doing some work in DC on a client engagement with a consulting firm that I had been working with for 20 years prior, off and on, doing client engagements with them. I would get a call. I would often show up the next day after flying to whatever city I was needed. I wondered how I would be able to operate in a business environment with clients day to day. But I welcomed the opportunity because I would be working with people that I knew. So there was that familiar aspect to it, and knowing that I would be helpful and instrumental. What I didn't know was that I would be having experiences there that were of a different sort. You see, I had been consulting for some time prior, and there was something that I did that I took for granted, and that was where I would have these quiet conversations with people who would take me into their confidence. And it would only go so far. We would maintain a business relationship, and it wouldn't really get too personal. The difference was that my client, the one who was leading this project, and his second in command, if you will, they began sharing with me some personal concerns personal experiences, and would do so when we were driving to or from the client site, or when we would be out for dinner. And it changed the nature of the relationship that I had with them, in terms of being purely professional to being more personal with one another. And I didn't feel that there was anything that I felt I needed to share with them, but it seemed perhaps that the purpose I served was to be a sounding board for them. And they recognized this as a safe place for them to express whatever was on their minds, or perhaps whatever burdens they were carrying that they felt they needed to unburden themselves from. And so I would listen and listen and acknowledge and occasionally pose a question. And by the time we were done talking, I could see a visible change in them, relief. And I think all of us have been told at one time or another, I've never told anyone this, but... And those conversations were had too. That experience was pivotal because it ushered in a new chapter in my life, one that would last for several years and would ultimately cause my daughter to look at me and say, "Dad, you are not the same person you used to be. Even from when you changed before, and you weren't the same person you used to be then."